Today I want to talk to you and demonstrate to you how to make your slab for the tile project. So as I explained to you guys in earlier videos and in class, we're making a tile, and that tile is going to have a design on it, which we've been working on with our sketches. After we finish our sketches and we make our slab for our tile, we're going to draw that design onto the clay, and instead of us seeing the lines of the design when we finish, we're going to see a change in texture or pattern on the tile, and that's what's going to show us our design. So each of the little areas that you've created in your design is going to be filled with a different texture or pattern. So you're going to make those textures or patterns by molding and pinching little pieces of clay and making different shapes and attaching them to the clay in a logical manner in a pattern to create that pattern or texture. Or you're going to find objects to impress into the clay in the same manner to create a texture or a pattern. So the first way we want to start this is to make our slab. So I'm going to set these aside so we can go ahead and make a slab. So I've got my clay here, which I've already prepared. I pulled the plastic down from around my bag, and I cut off a good 1.5 to 2 inches of clay. You don't want to skimp on this, because if you take too little clay, when you go to expand it and make your slab, it may end up being too thin, or you may not make a large enough slab to be able to get the size that we need for our tile. So go ahead and cut off an ample amount so that you don't come up short. If you've got extra, that's great. You just take the excess and put it back in your bag. But you don't want to come up short, because then you have to start the whole process over again. So I've gone ahead and I've wedged this. And just as a review, when you're wedging, you're going to use the heels of the palms of your hand. You put them on top. You're going to let your fingers drape down over the front. And then you're just going to press down and then bring your hands back up, and the clay will stand back up with it. Reposition your hands. Press down again, stand it back up. Press down again, stand it up, reposition your hands, press down again. And again, that's just going to fold and spiral the clay into itself to compress it, to get rid of any air pockets that might be in the clay, and to remix your clay and make it all consistent. Sometimes as we work with our bag of clay, we put scrap clay back in it, and so you've got really moist clay along with some clay that might be a little bit drier. So if we take the time to wedge it, it will go ahead and make it all the same consistency. So after you wedge it, what I would like you to do is tap it on the board and put it into somewhat of a cube shape. If you want to use the heel of your hand, you can pat down on it. Don't want to hurt your wrist any, but you do want to go ahead and just tap it into a cube shape. If you have big wrinkles in it or lines like this, just take your finger and smear those together. The smoother your clay is at this point, without wrinkles or lines in it, the easier it's going to be to make a nice slab without wrinkles or lines in it. Okay, so now at this point, we're going to go ahead and flip this on the board to get it to expand. And what we're trying to do when flipping it is we're trying to get the clay to hit the board at an angle so that it will catch on the board and it will expand. It's kind of like skipping a rock on a lake or on a body of water. If you throw it from a shallow angle and it hits the surface, it's going to skip. Well, kind of the same idea with the clay. If it hits, it's going to skip or catch as it hits the surface, and the clay will stretch and expand. And so we want to do this to expand the clay. It's a lot easier than, say, trying to take a rolling pin and roll it out in this thicker shape. Okay, so to do this, we're going to grab it with our hands here, and we're going to toss it lightly towards us. Don't throw it straight down. That'll just make a loud noise and create a lot of dust. So we're just going to put it out in front of us and toss it back towards us. And it's going to hit the surface, and it's going to grab onto it and kind of skip, and it's going to start to stretch the clay out. Now if we keep going in one direction, we're going to end up with a long narrow strip, but since we want our tile to be a square, we're going to go ahead and pick this up and turn it, before I do it anymore, I'm going to scrape that extra clay off of there. So I'm going to turn it and do the same thing from the other direction. So as I'm doing this, you can kind of see the clay grabbing the surface and starting to expand. Now we want to just expand this until we feel like it's about the thickness of a pencil, about 1/4 of an inch thick. Now, how do you determine that? Well, a lot of it is just on experience and how many slabs you've made. Having done this over time, I think this is my 27th year of doing ceramics, so you start to get a feel for how much you need to flip the clay to get it to be the thickness you want. Since you guys are all new to this, you want to err on the side of it being too thick, because then we can use the tubes, the rolling pin, so forth, to make it the proper thickness. But if you get it too thin, then you're going to have to squish it up and do the whole thing over again. We do want it to be 1/4 of an inch thick, no thinner, because we're going to be making impressions into the clay. If it's too thin, it's going to weaken the structure of the clay, and it could cause it to just break or snap. So we don't want to get it too thin. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to grab a plastic bag. Just give me 1 second. Okay, so I grabbed the plastic bag. This is an old clay bag. And I'm going to try to flatten it out so that it doesn't have any wrinkles. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to transfer my clay. Instead of it staying on the board, I'm going to put it on top of the bag. And the reason I'm going to do that is so that my clay will not stick to the board or stick to the surface that I'm working on. If I put it on the plastic, I'll be able to pick up the plastic later, move it around, and I won't have to worry about it sticking to the board. So at this point, I have my slab, but I want to make sure it's the proper thickness. So first thing I'm going to do is take one of these wood boards, and I'm going to cut one side straight. So to make sure I have enough clay, I'm going to measure this and make sure I've got a good 8" by 8" section. And it looks like I should be fine. So I'm going to trim some clay off of the side here so that I have a nice straight edge. You can use a ruler, you can use a yardstick, you could use a nice straight board if you have a nice straight board, whatever you might have. And you can just put this clay in your bag. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is measure over 8 inches from my straight edge, and I'm going to do that in 2 places so that when I connect the lines, I know I'm getting a strip of clay that's 8 inches wide. Okay, so then I'm going to take my board again, line up on my 2 marks, and go ahead and cut this. When you're cutting this, you can use a butter knife, you can use an X-Acto knife, you can use a steak knife, whatever you might have that will cut the clay. You can even unfold a paper clip and use the tip of the paper clip like a pin tool or a needle tool, and that will cut through your clay as well. So if I hold this up, hopefully you can see if the bag's not in the way. If I put my pencil here, the clay is slightly thicker than the pencil. The pencil is roughly 1/4 of an inch thick, and that's what we want our whole slab to be. So that's why I say err on the side of making it too thick, because we can always thin it out. If you make it too thin, the only way to get it thick again is to squish it all up, re-wedge it, and start all over again. So before we do anything else, we want to try and make sure that this is just 1/4 of an inch thick. So we have a couple of options. So I have this trim molding, which is exactly the thickness of the pencil. And that's the thickness we would love the clay. So what we can do, if we can come up with 2 pieces of molding the same, we can put this on the side of the clay as a guide. And what we'll do then is use a tube or a rolling pin, and we'll basically roll against the clay, and it'll flatten it down to be the same level as the sticks. As long as our roller stays on the level of the sticks or the guides, it won't get any thinner than that, and it'll make it the proper thickness. Now, if you don't have a couple sticks at home, there are a few options that you can try. If you've got a cardboard box, you could cut down the sides of your cardboard box. I had something come from Amazon lately. just recently, and I kept the box. And so I cut the box, and basically 3 strips of the cardboard that the box came in are about the same width as what the pencil is. So if you have a box, you could bring a pencil over and see if it's the same thickness. Maybe you only need 2 pieces, maybe you need 3, just depends on the thickness of the box. And instead of using the boards, you could go ahead and put strips of cardboard on both sides of it. And that could be your guide for when you roll down with your roller. If you don't have a cardboard box, but maybe you have some magazines at your house, you could go ahead and do the same thing. It depends on the thickness of your magazine, but just go ahead and hold up a pencil and see if you can find one that is the same thickness of a pencil, or if you need to stack 2 of them. And then you could go ahead and put your magazines on both sides, and then you'll be able to use a rolling pin, and those will be your guides so that it doesn't go too thin. And if you don't have magazines at home, maybe you have some newspaper, and perhaps you can do the same thing with newspaper. You might need to fold the newspaper over, or maybe you could use 3 or 2 sections of newspaper, whatever it takes, to make it the thickness of a pencil. And again, you're going to use that like a guide. So those are some options. And the last thing would be, if you have absolutely nothing that you can find that matches the thickness of a pencil, you can just eyeball it, and you can hopefully flip and make your clay a proper thickness, and do the best that you can. Another thing you also might look at is maybe you'll have some books, some children's books, thin books, that maybe would work. But again, if you can't find anything at all, then you can go ahead and just flip it and kind of eyeball it when you cut it, see if it's close to being the thickness of a pencil, and go from there. I'm going to go ahead and use this rolling pin and roll out this clay. Now sometimes if you've used something over and over again, the clay will stick to it and the surface will pick up the dryness of the, or little pieces of the clay. We don't want that on here, because as I roll this into the clay, if I have those dry pieces of clay on the roller, it's going to impress down into the soft clay. So I just use a gift card, and I go ahead and I just scrape the old clay off. So then what you're going to do is just line this up, and we're going to roll this out so that our clay ends up being the same thickness from end to end, and it'll be the thickness of the boards. Okay? So if you don't have a rolling pin, a couple options. If you have some PVC pipe or tubing at home, it doesn't have to be this thick, but it would just need to be at least 8 inches wide. You could use that and roll out your clay. If perhaps you got a poster or something that came in a cardboard tube, or maybe you got some new carpet, or you know where to get the cardboard tubes or rolls that the carpets are wrapped around, you could cut off or use a piece of that, and it will do exactly the same thing. Okay? If you can't find those things, a couple other options, kind of weird, but a dowel rod is fine. If you've got a plunger at home, they usually have a wood dowel rod inside of them. You can just twist it and take the dowel rod out, and you can use that like a rolling pin. Same thing. And you can press that and roll it along your guides, and that will level out your clay so it's the same thickness. If you don't have a plunger, but say you have a broom, you could do the same thing using a broom handle. And this is a broom here. You would just need to put it in such a place that as you roll it, the broom would drape over the side of the table and it's not going to hit the table. But it's the same idea. Okay? So try to find something that you can use so that you can roll and level out your clay so that it's the same thickness. Once you've done that, we'll take away one of the boards, and I'm going to go ahead and just use this to trim a tiny little bit off because it distorted a little bit as I was trimming it or flattening it. I'm going to take that extra little bit of clay off so it's nice and square. And then once again, I'm just going to measure across to make sure it's no more than 8 inches. And like I say, it did stretch a little bit as I rolled it, and that's normal. So that's why I want to double check it and retrim it. Line up on those marks. Go ahead and trim it so it's nice and square. Okay, so now we want to square off one end and then measure 8 inches from that. So since I have this book here that's already, magazine, that's already a 90-degree angle that's nice and square, I'm going to go ahead and just lay that on my straight edge. I'm going to go ahead and make a mark at the bottom of both ends. Set that aside, and then I will go ahead and line this up and cut across here. So now at this point, I want to measure up from the bottom 8 inches. We're trying to make this 8 by 8, nice and square. Gonna make a mark. Do the same thing at the other side. Take my straight edge and cut across that. Okay. Take up this extra clay. I'm just going to set that aside for a moment. So now I have my 8 by 8 inch square, which is going to end up being my tile. Okay? So at this point, what you can do is get your sketches that we worked so hard on, and you're going to take the one that you picked or decided it was your best, that you did all the variations on and selected, and that's what you're going to put on here. So when you go to draw this on here, you're just going to take the tip of a pencil and you're just going to start at any point depending on your design, and you're going to go ahead and you're going to lightly draw the line on here. It doesn't have to go in deep. You don't want it to go in deep. If it goes in deep, it can weaken the clay so that when you pick it up, it'll want to bend there or maybe even snap. So just light enough that you can see your design on here. Now, if you mess up and you're like, ooh, I drew that in the wrong place, that's not where I wanted it, just take your finger and smooth back over it and cover it up. And then you can go back and redraw it. If you want, and you have some water handy and a little sponge, you can squeeze all the water out of your sponge after you get it wet, and you can go back and use a sponge, and you can smooth out the surface with a sponge. And that will go ahead and get rid of the line that perhaps you drew in the wrong place, or it's not the right proportions, and just smooth it out. Once you've done that, you can take your pencil and go back and adjust and draw until you get your design sketched out onto your tile. So after you get it all sketched out, we want to make sure that this doesn't dry out. So since we already have it on the bag, we're going to leave it on the bag. And what you can do to make sure that it has plenty of moisture, see if I can get that little bit off of there without messing it up. You can either take a sponge before you draw it on so that you don't mess up the drawing afterwards. And you could just moisten it with the sponge first, or you could take your spray bottle and just give it a spray or two of water. After you've done that, you're going to take the bag and just go ahead and fold it over carefully. Try not to press on it too hard. Try not to have any wrinkles in the bag. Then bring over the other end as well. So kind of like wrapping a present. And then what you can do is just lift this up carefully and tuck this under. That way it won't open up, it won't get any air, and your clay is not going to dry out. And then do that on the other end as well. And after you've done that, you can just set it wherever you're storing your work. If you have the board and you want to leave it on the surface of the board, that's perfectly fine. If you want to pick it up and carry it and put it on another counter somewhere or a shelf to store it, that's fine also. Just know that this clay is very soft, very tactile. If you squeeze it, or you bump it into something, it's going to pick up those impressions and it's going to mess up your tile. So at this point, we want to be super careful with it, and we want to make sure we don't bump it, we don't squeeze it, we don't bang it around. So I'm going to go ahead and set this aside for a second, and I'm going to grab another one just to show you real quick. So this is the design that I had picked out of my sketches, and I did this earlier today. So you can see I don't draw perfect the first time. I actually am kind of sketchy when I come to drawing, and so my lines don't look perfect. But that's okay, because when we go to work on this and we start making our impressions and we start building our texture on top of it, all those lines are going to get covered up either with a design or with an impression, and you're not going to see them. What you're going to see instead of your design in terms of lines is going to be the change in texture or pattern. Okay? So if you're a little sketchy, it's not going to hurt it any at all. And you can always go back after you've done that, and if it's a little sketchy, you can take your finger and you can smear on it and you can clean it up a little bit. So again, what I'll do is I will close this up and cover it, and then we'll be ready to work on it at our next session. Okay? Whoops. We'll do it this way. Now lastly, if you have a little bit of clay left, a couple things you can do, and I will go grab a couple objects. 1 second. Okay, so I tend to keep a little container in my desk of just different objects and things that I find that I think might make nice impressions. And I just start a little collection of things. And that way, when we go to do this assignment, I have a variety of different things to try for impressions, for creating texture or pattern. So this was on a tip of a pen, so it could clip on your shirt. And it's just a little squiggly line with a ball. And what you can do is experiment on a spare piece of clay. You always want to try it on a spare piece of clay before you try it on your tile. Because that way, if you don't like it or it doesn't look well, you haven't ruined your tile. If you go straight away and you put this on your tile and you don't like it, the only way to get rid of it is to squish up your clay, re-wedge it, and start the project all over again. We don't want to waste time. We want to go ahead and try and get it right the first time. So practice on a piece of spare clay first, but you just want to get used to impressing things and seeing what kind of design they make, and then also get a feel for how deep you need to press in and how firm you need to press in to get the impression to turn out really nice. What I have found is if you make your impression straight away when the clay is really wet, the object likes to stick to the clay somewhat. And as a result, you don't get as clean or as nice an impression. If you make this one day and your clay gets a chance to somewhat dry overnight to the next day, then it makes neater, cleaner impressions than when it's really wet. So that's why we don't want to flood it and get it too sticky. Another one that sometimes is nice is if you can find the heads of screws, whether they're Phillips head or flat head, and you press them in, and you can make some neat impressions that way. And as you repeat them in a pattern, it creates a nice texture, a nice look. This was a little container that held leads for a mechanical pencil. So again, you can use that, and if you repeat it, you could do a design with it, or you could just do straight rows, and that creates a texture or a pattern. Sometimes you can take the screws or the bolts and you can lay them sideways, and it will pick up the actual threads of the screw or the bolt, and that makes a nice impression. So you could do it that way. You could also turn it this way so you pick up the head of the bolt or the screw, and that makes a nice impression. So there's lots of little things you can come up with that will create different textures, different patterns that are that will be interesting to your design. Just the other day I found this little screw or spring. I haven't tried it. I'm not sure what it'll look like, but it might be something that you could press in. That's not real that interesting. Maybe if you rolled it, it would look good. I don't know. Not sure I'm thrilled with that, but I just thought initially it looked like it might be interesting, but now I'm thinking it's boring and it's horrible. So again, that's why we practice it first. So look for different objects, see what you can come up with. Sometimes you can find things like bottle caps, jewelry, earrings, maybe caps of pens and pencils and markers. So a lot of them have different designs on them as you impress them. You might find things like coral or bark or seashells that might make interesting textures that you'll be able to put into your project. So just kind of look around, experiment, see what you can find. When you're all finished, since we're not saving this, again, just make sure you squish everything up, put it back in your bag, and if you feel like it's gotten a little bit dry, give it a spray or two of water so it'll stay nice and moist in your bag. If you feel like it's still quite moist and sticky, then you don't need to add water to it. Okay? And then always pull your bag up, try to squeeze all the air out, give it a spin, use your twist tie and twist tie it up, and then I usually flip mine upside down if I have put water in it, and that just helps to make sure it doesn't get any more air inside, and it keeps the water at the top so that top piece that I cut off is nice and moist when I go to use it. Okay, so that's the way we're going to start with our making our slab for our first project for the tile. And just practice flipping the clay back and forth. If you feel like you're not quite getting it, don't worry about it. It's a skill that takes practice. You can always squish it back up, re-wedge it, flip it again. And I would say, just remember, don't get carried away and overflip it to where you make it too thin. Err on the side of thick, then you can always use your guides to flatten it out. And again, if you don't have guides, just do the best you can to eyeball it, and then go ahead and cut it so that it's 8 inches by 8 inches. All right? I will see you next time.